So I want to welcome you here to this absolutely wonderful conference today. My name is Kimberly Martin. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College here at Columbia, and I direct the program on U.S. Russia Relations at the Harriman Institute at Columbia. I think it's going to be a fantastic program with really top experts from the U.S., from Russia, and from Europe, all getting together to talk about very significant problems in U.S. Russia relations today. I want to express my gratitude to President Trump and President Putin for setting a good context for our conference today. A readout of their phone conversation from this past Tuesday indicated that they are both interested in pursuing strategic stability, limiting the arms race, and thinking about the possibility of a high-level meeting. And the Kremlin website reported that their conversation on Tuesday was, quote-unquote, constructive and businesslike, which, according to what Henry Kissinger said in the early 1970s détente period, is an important signal of optimism. However, yesterday, the Kremlin spokesperson said, we don't expect a breakthrough anytime soon. So we'll see what that means. Before we get started, I just want to speak a little bit about the program on U.S. Russia relations. It's funded by the Harriman Institute. It has been funded for the past 3 years. We just got word that we will be able to continue for an additional 3 years, but at a lower level of funding. And so we're currently hopeful that we might get some grant support or an outside donor support to keep it going at the same level that it's been at. But I just want to tell you a little bit about what it is that we've been doing over the past 3 years. One of the things that we've been doing is what we call the Student Forum that meets monthly during the academic year, where students at the undergraduate and graduate level, both from the Columbia University community and then from elsewhere in the New York City greater metropolitan area, get together and have a visiting speaker come and speak to them just to speak to students. And they have a role in choosing who the speaker should be. We've had journalists, we've had business leaders, we've had academics, we've had some policy people come in. And it's a really successful program. They have food served at the program, so it's a little bit more informal, and it's been working at a very strong level. Then we have an exchange program with the Institute for World Economics and International Relations, the Primakov Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. That is now being funded going forward with generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And the purpose of that program is to bring young people together from both the New York area and from IMAMO who are working on common issues, not because we expect that the research that they're doing is necessarily going to have an impact anytime soon, but in the hopes that it will build networks going forward, that when these young people get to the peak of their careers 20 years from now, the situation may have changed and they'll have memories of this experience that they had together, and they'll have the connections, especially if they keep connected on Facebook, which they have up until now, to really have a chance for something, even though we're not expecting any breakthroughs anytime soon. Another thing that we've done is what we call conversations with diplomats. We have on our websites interviews conducted with diplomats that are either faculty members or alums of the Harriman Institute who have experience working in Russia or on Russian questions, to give us a sense of what the history is and to have a little bit of a sense of the biographies of people who have played a very strong role in those relations in the past. And then we've had visiting speakers on a wide variety of issues, including many speakers from Russia on a regular basis. So the conference today marks our 6th major conference. The first one in the fall of 2014 gathered US and Russian historians and political scientists to ask whether the current downturn in US-Russia relations could take any lessons from the end of the détente period in the 1970s. The second conference in the spring of 2015 focused on an area where there actually is an amazing degree of continuing cooperation between the US and Russia, and that is in the Arctic. And so we had people speaking about energy, about political, diplomatic issues, and also about military issues in the Arctic. The third conference was on Afghanistan from both a historic perspective and a current events perspective, looking at what the US-Soviet relationship was like concerning Afghanistan in the past and what the US-Russian relationship is like there today and what is happening. The next brought US and Russian scholars together to discuss future scenarios of relations between Russia and the West. And then to ensure that the humanities were also included, we also had a conference hosted in cooperation with Barnard College on Dancing the Cold War, where we had scholars and dancers themselves and choreographers get together and talk about dance and ballet as a form of cultural diplomacy during the Cold War and what that meant. So the overall purpose of our program continues to be to explore both the possibilities and the limits of U.S.-Russia cooperation going forward. And I just want to welcome you again to this wonderful conference today with a fantastic group of experts across the globe sharing their perspectives on this very important set of questions. I just want to remind everyone that the conference today is on the record. That's for both the speakers and for audience members who contribute questions in the Q&A that follows. We are being recorded. It will be put on the Harriman website following the conference. And when we get to the Q&A period, there will be a microphone on a stand, and people who have questions can just line up behind that microphone to ask their questions. So welcome, everyone. And now let's get started with the first panel.
Welcome, greetings to those. Kim, I think the program has really done some marvelous things, and this conference looks very exciting, and I'm glad to start it. The ground rules pretty simple. That there are three of our speakers, and they'll get 20 minutes, and my main role as speaker will be passing nasty notes if people talk too long. And then we will open it up as two questions. I will probably take the prerogative of the chair to make the first, and the microphone will be back there. We ask you just to line up for that. Let me just mention who our speakers are. You have their bios, and there's nothing worse than reading what you can read. So I'll just say that we'll go in the order in which they're seated. That's, I think, the best way, with Matt Kronig from Georgetown going first, Olga Oliker from, they're not listed here. CSIA, all these places in Washington that I live. CSIS, one of our major think tanks, and Pavel Podvig is an independent analyst in Geneva who's written a great deal about Russian, first Soviet, and then Russian nuclear program. So we've got a very informed group. And with that, we're actually on time. Matt?
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Jervis. It's a pleasure to be here in New York at Columbia University. Thank you also to Kim Martin for her work in organizing this important conference, to the Harriman Institute, and to Columbia University. So this first panel is on strategic issues in U.S.-Russia relations. And we're here today to talk about conflict and cooperation in U.S.-Russia relations. And so I want to talk about three issues. First, strategic stability and strategic deterrence. Second, arms control. And third, non-proliferation. And essentially, I see the first area as one where there is a lot of conflict and more conflict than we've had in the recent past. In arms control, I think it's a bit of a mixed story. And non-proliferation, I actually see some opportunities for near-term cooperation. So first on strategic deterrence, I think the risk of nuclear war between the United States and Russia is low, but probably higher now than it's been at any time since the Cold War. And not to point fingers, but I think much of the responsibility for this does lie with Russia. And the reason is I think that countries that are conventionally weaker tend to rely on nuclear weapons more in their strategy. That's a pattern we've seen throughout history. So during the Cold War, it was the United States that relied more on nuclear weapons in its strategy to deter a major Russian invasion of Western Europe. The United States held out the threat of nuclear retaliation. Today in South Asia, we see Pakistan relying on early threats of nuclear escalation as a way to deter conventionally superior India. And since the end of the Cold War, again, I think Russia has relied on nuclear weapons as a way to offset the conventional superiority of the United States and NATO. So looking at the way the United States has thought about nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War, the United States has tried to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. Every major NATO strategy, every major U.S. nuclear national security strategy, nuclear posture review, has held out reducing reliance on nuclear weapons as a goal in and of itself. The United States has made cuts to its strategic nuclear forces. and its tactical nuclear forces, the presidential nuclear initiatives at the end of the Cold War. The United States looked at a lot of its battlefield nuclear weapons. Remember, during the Cold War, we developed nuclear torpedoes, depth charges, artillery. At the end of the Cold War, Western leaders said, well, that was silly. Why did we do that? Let's get rid of this stuff, and we did. And I think this trend really reached its peak with President Obama, who I think more so than any other president held out the hope of a world without nuclear weapons. In contrast, over the past decade and a half or so, I think Russia has relied more on nuclear weapons in its strategy. And you see that in terms of strategy, statements, exercises, and capabilities. So when it comes to strategic nuclear forces, the United States and Russia, of course, have parity negotiated in the series of arms control agreements, including the New START agreement of 2010. But Russia is finishing a modernization cycle of its strategic nuclear forces, deploying new missiles and submarines. The United States has plans to do the same, but at this point, just plans. Russia's finishing its modernization cycle. And also Russia's and President Putin have dreamed up a brand new generation of nuclear weapons, never even envisioned during the Cold War. And Putin announced these capabilities just a couple of weeks ago. A nuclear-powered nuclear cruise missile. So this just isn't a nuclear-armed cruise missile, it's a cruise missile powered by a mini nuclear reactor, essentially giving it unlimited range. So this is something the United States thought of during the Cold War and decided not to go in this route because it would essentially spew radiation over your own territory and the territory of your allies. But Russia is developing this capability, also a nuclear-armed submarine drone, so essentially an autonomous nuclear-armed drone that could pull up undetected in, say, Baltimore Harbor and detonate spewing radioactive material over a U.S. city. Now, when Putin made these announcements, many experts said, well, is this real? Is this just science fiction? But talking to my friends in government, they say that they've been tracking these issues for some time and that these are real capabilities, not just something that Putin made up. At the tactical level, Russia has a large tactical nuclear advantage. So at the end of the Cold War, the United States said, let's get rid of all these battlefield nuclear weapons. Russia got rid of a lot of their nuclear weapons as well, but they've also kept a lot of these nuclear weapons. So Russia still has nuclear-armed torpedoes, nuclear-armed depth charges, nuclear-armed mines, a lot of these battlefield nuclear weapons that the United States and NATO have gotten rid of. So that's in terms of capabilities Russia is relying on more, and I think actually has, depending on how you look at it, a degree of advantage over the United States in nuclear capabilities. Although Sarah Huckabee Sanders disagrees with me on that. When Putin announced his new capabilities a couple of weeks ago, Sarah Huckabee Sanders actually quoted John Kennedy from 1963 by saying the United States nuclear arsenal is, quote, second to none. But I think there are questions about that now. Also, if you look at strategy, I think Russia has relied on nuclear threats more in its strategy, both to offset NATO conventional superiority, but also as a tool of intimidation against the West. So at the height of the Ukrainian crisis, President Putin made explicit nuclear threats, said Russia is a major nuclear power, it's best not to mess with us. Other statements from high-level Russian officials threatening Western European states that if they deploy NATO missile defenses, they'll be the target of possible Russian nuclear attacks. Posturing nuclear forces in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War, nuclear-capable bombers and submarines signaling with those forces. And when it comes to strategy, and this is something that's somewhat debated, and I think Olga will likely speak to this, maybe she and I can have a debate, but the official U.S. government position and my read of Russian strategy is that they have this idea of escalate to de-escalate or de-escalatory nuclear strikes. But basically the idea is that rather than lose a major conventional war with NATO, that Russia would use a small number of nuclear weapons, potentially early in a conflict, as a way to frighten Western leaders into backing down. So one of the, I think, greatest nightmare scenarios I can imagine is what if Russia, and I think it's unlikely, but that's the the goal of national security strategy, is to think of these unlikely scenarios and think of ways to make them even less likely. But what if Russia replays its playbook from Ukraine against a Baltic state? This would be a NATO ally. The United States and the West would have to come to their defense. So now you have Russia and the West in a major war. There are a lot of indications that in this kind of conflict, Russia may use nuclear weapons early, again, trying to force Western leaders to think, do we really want to fight a nuclear war over Estonia? Let's just back down and let Russia have Estonia. It's not worth it. But of course, there's the danger that the United States wouldn't back down and we'd be in a nuclear exchange. So I think because of these developments in Russian strategy, the United States has been forced reluctantly to again reemphasize nuclear weapons in its strategy, really for the first time since the end of the Cold War, in the Trump administration Nuclear Posture Review released just a couple of weeks ago. And there had been some developments also within NATO under the Obama administration of NATO, emphasizing that it is a nuclear alliance, that it's willing to defend its interest with nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence if necessary. But in particular, to counter this Russia escalate to de-escalate threat, the Trump administration made clear that the United States and NATO also have the ability, if necessary, to conduct limited nuclear strikes. Because I think the Russian strategy, in the words of Henry Kissinger, is meant to force Western leaders to choose between suicide and surrender. If Russia uses 1 or 2 nuclear weapons on the battlefield, do we decide to just back down? Or do we decide to retaliate with nuclear weapons, which could spiral out of control and result in a massive nuclear exchange? I think this new strategy is meant to find space between suicide and surrender, and so the Trump doctrine says the United States can also retaliate with limited nuclear strikes of its own. And to make that credible, the Nuclear Posture Review is calling for the development of 2 new low-yield nuclear capabilities. So a new submarine-launched cruise missile and a low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile. These capabilities were controversial, but I think there is a degree of consensus among defense experts. Several of Obama administration defense officials have endorsed these capabilities as a way to counter the Russian nuclear threats. And with all nuclear strategy, the point of these capabilities, of course, isn't to fight a nuclear war with Russia, but the opposite, to deter it, to make it clear to Russia and Putin that there's no reason to go down this route in the first place, that if they think that limited nuclear strikes is the key to victory, that actually that will just lead to further nuclear escalation. It's not a wise approach. So again, I think this area has become more conflictual, probably more conflictual than it's been since the end of the Cold War. Second, arms control. I think here the record is a little bit mixed, although maybe more negative than positive. Because I think kind of part and parcel of Russia's strategy of relying more on nuclear weapons, Russia has become less interested in arms control with the West. So in the Obama administration, President Obama agreed to cut strategic nuclear arsenals further. The New START treaty negotiated in 2010, we agreed to reduce our arsenals to 1,550 strategic deployed warheads. And just to remind everyone how significant that is from where we were during the Cold War, 1967, the United States had 31,255 nuclear weapons. 1986, at its peak, Russia had 40,000 nuclear weapons. So now, according to the New START treaty, which has gone into effect, both countries are in compliance. Both countries have no more than 1,550 strategic deployed nuclear weapons. So 2013, Obama offered to go lower to 1,000 warheads. Russia said niet. They weren't interested in going. And I'm more of a nuclear expert than a Russian expert, so that's the extent of my knowledge of the Russian language. So now both Russia was unwilling to go lower. And also, many of these legacy arms control agreements are no longer holding. So the Bush administration pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in the early 2000s. Russia according to the U.S. government and according to my reading, is violating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Although Russia disputes this and Russia makes counter accusations that the United States is in fact in violation. But the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 may be the most successful arms control agreement in history, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, intermediate range, nuclear-capable, ground-launched nuclear-capable missiles. The United States asserts that Russia has tested a ground-launched cruise missile within that range, which is a violation. In response, the new U.S. defense bill allocates funding for the United States to conduct research and development into its own intermediate range missile. Now, it takes 7 to 10 years to develop a new missile, so the United States wouldn't be in violation of the treaty until it tested or fielded this missile. But this is the early stages of a response to the Russian violation. So this could lead to intermediate range nuclear forces, again deployed in Europe. Was a major success to get rid of those at the end of the Cold War, and they may be coming back. So the one area really of cooperation that's left in arms control is at the strategic level, the New START Treaty. So the New START Treaty was negotiated in 2010, but actually just went into effect February of this year, last month. So the treaty was negotiated such that both sides had to reach the limits by February 2018. According to new State Department data, both countries are in compliance. Both countries have come down below those levels. But the treaty expires in a couple of years, or a few years, and there is a provision in the treaty to extend it. And so I think that will be a major issue in U.S. Russia arms control. Will the two sides be able to extend this agreement into the future? I think it would be in the United States' interest. I know many Russian experts think it would be in Russia's interest. But given that all of these other legacy arms control agreements have kind of fallen apart, what is the future of New START? And I think that's really probably the most important one, because if Russia decides for whatever reason, for example, not to extend the treaty, to expand its nuclear forces, I'm confident that U.S. defense officials aren't going to feel comfortable allowing Russia to have a strategic quantitative nuclear advantage. So I suspect that the United States would increase its numbers, and we could be into a new arms race again in strategic capabilities. Final point I'd like to make is moving to non-proliferation. And here I actually see some possibility of cooperation. The United States and Russia during the Cold War disagreed on a lot, but one area we agreed on was that it wasn't in our interest for other countries to have nuclear weapons, and I think that shared interest continues. And I think we saw a lot of cooperation between the United States and Russia, for example, historically in negotiating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, many other institutions of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, but just recently in the Iran nuclear deal. The Obama administration's view was that Russia played a very helpful and constructive role. This all may have been called into question by the appointment yesterday of John Bolton as the new National Security Advisor, who's a well-known skeptic of the Iran nuclear deal. But if not, I think the Trump administration's strategy for addressing some of the gaps in the Iran nuclear deal does potentially create an opportunity for future U.S.-Russia cooperation on this. So during, as you may remember, in 2016, 2015, when the Iran nuclear deal was negotiated, this was one of the most controversial and partisan foreign policy issues in the United States. Democrats and some Republicans, well, all Republicans and some Democrats opposed the deal. Democrats supported it. Every major U.S. presidential candidate promised to get rid of the deal. Trump was actually something of a moderate in this regard. Rubio and Walker and Ted Cruz said they'd rip it up on day one. Trump said he wanted to renegotiate it. I think many people thought that this was just laughable. How are you going to renegotiate this deal? It's been negotiated with international partners. There's a UN Security Council resolution. But in fact, quietly over the past year or so, the Trump administration has made some progress on renegotiating the deal, and this has been reported past few days in the New York Times. But there is widespread agreement that there are some problems with the deal. It doesn't cover Iranian ballistic missiles, and Iran is working on longer-range missiles. The U.S. Missile Defense Agency estimates that Iran could have an ICBM capable of reaching the United States in the next few years. And the limits on Iran's nuclear program are not permanent. They expire over time with these sunset clauses. So even the Obama administration officials who negotiated this deal have said that, well, we're going to have to come back and address these flaws at some point in the future. We can't just let these limits expire. Now, I think most Obama administration officials would have preferred to wait because the limits don't begin to expire. The most important limits don't begin to expire until 10 years out. So I guess, 2 years in now, so 8 years from now. So I think most Obama administration officials would have preferred to wait a few years before trying to negotiate a kind of follow-on agreement to address the sunset clauses. But given that the Trump administration is intent on doing it now, there actually is a fair amount of bipartisan and international agreement that it's time to go ahead and start addressing this. So I've been in meetings in Washington, again, with Obama administration officials of, if we're going to do this, how to do it in a responsible way. There's a lot of reporting that the EU3, Britain, France, and Germany have been in close conversation with the Trump administration, look for an announcement in the next couple of weeks of their intention to try to renegotiate, or, it's funny, in diplomacy, language is important, so they don't like the term renegotiate or fix the flaws in the deal. But if you talk about negotiating a supplemental agreement to cover issues not addressed in the deal, then you can get a lot of bipartisan and international support. But the Trump administration strategy is to start with this core group of the EU3 and the United States, of the need to address these gaps in the deal. And then the hope is, over time, to bring on China and Russia to agree that this is something that needs to be accomplished over the next couple of years. And once you can get that P5+1 unity, then to bring the Iranians into the discussion. Again, this may be another opportunity for U.S. Russia cooperation, because I think Russia also has a stake in not letting Iran go nuclear. Russia also has a stake in not letting Iran get long-range ballistic missiles. And Russia also has an economic stake. It's a supplier of Iranian nuclear reactors, nuclear fuel. If Iran develops its own commercial-sized nuclear program, that could mean lost revenue for the Russians. So I think for all these reasons, this can be an area of cooperation. So just to wrap up, three major areas: nuclear strategy and strategic stability. I'm concerned, and I think there is a real risk of nuclear war. And I think these recent steps by the Trump administration should work to reestablish deterrence and raise the threshold of nuclear war, not lower it, as some have charged. Arms control, a little bit mixed. I hope the New START treaty, I hope we can negotiate a follow-on agreement. And then finally, non-proliferation, some areas for cooperation, including a supplemental agreement to the Iran nuclear deal. So I'll end my remarks there and very much look forward to the comments of my colleagues and question and answer. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping exactly on the time.
Right.
Olga?
Okay. Just want to start off by saying how thrilled I am to be here. Say big thanks to Kim Martin for organizing this, and it really is an honor to be on this panel with my fellow panelists and with Professor Jervis as moderator. I can't imagine, I literally can't imagine a better moderator on a session regarding nuclear strategy. So I'm really very excited about this. So. This conversation is billed in the program as being about nuclear and strategic issues. And it struck me when I was preparing my notes that it's been a while since nuclear weapons got to open a U.S. Russia conference. It's also rare that I get more than 10 minutes to speak about nuclear weapons. So with Matt having presented what I might call a U.S. government adjacent viewpoint, if that's fair, and Pavel is one of the smartest people on earth about Russia's nuclear weapons complex as a whole. I'm going to try to do a couple of things that they won't be covering. I'm going to discuss Russian nuclear weapons in terms of strategy, which is to say where they fit in for Russia's broader global and strategic interests. I'm going to talk about how Russia thinks about them in terms of use, coercion, and deterrence. Spoiler, I do disagree with Matt on this one. And finally, what this means for the United States and U.S. policy, including, I'll add, if I'm wrong and Matt's right, what I think it means. So let's start with Russia's strategy and its goals. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I think we've heard a lot in the United States and in Europe that Russia's goals are to undermine our democracy and upend the global order. And I'm going to argue that that's not quite right. Rather, we've got a Russia which has had a foreign policy that's been pretty consistent over the last quarter century, which is to say since the Soviet Union fell. Russia has, since that time, sought to define a substantial great power role in the world. You'll hear Russia called a declining power and a resurgent power, sometimes at once, which is confusing. But in fact, Russia was a declining power in the 1990s as its economy went into free fall, social contracts went unfulfilled. But today, what you've got is economic stagnation, which has been going on for quite a while. And I'd argue that over the last few years, Russia's not declining. It's sorting through what the art of the possible is in an evolving world order, just like the rest of us, with changes that might be occurring faster than anticipated. It's looking to maximize its influence for the future, in the sense that when things do emerge in regions where Russia maybe doesn't have very clear interests, it'll be well positioned to defend those interests. Now, for most of the last 25 years, Russia has defined a lot of its global interests by looking to the United States as yardstick, adversary, and sometimes partner, adjusting its policies often to US policies. What are the Americans doing? Do we agree or disagree? Which of these things will serve us best? And then forward march. Now, there are exceptions, particularly in Russia's neighborhood, where policy stemmed very much from specific interests that had less to do with the United States, but which US actions and policies also affected. So and to a large extent, I would argue that Russia tended to see US policy as far more interested in Russia itself than it really was. Now, with the United States a lot less predictable on the world scene, Russia has found it can be more activist. There's a lot more room to do things, for instance, in Syria, but it comes with a level of responsibility it didn't necessarily expect. So where it thought that, for instance, we can challenge the United States and then strike a deal, instead they challenge the United States and they're left in the situation trying to find a way forward. Okay, so where do Russian nuclear weapons fit into all of this? I would say that to Russia, nuclear weapons play a number of roles, just as they do in the United States. First, though not necessarily foremost, but critically, they are an important reminder of Russia as a great power and its equality in at least this one fairly important area with the United States. They're also a tool of deterrence, importantly against a large-scale US attack. Now, this is first and foremost. Look, you don't have this many weapons unless you are deterring a whole lot of weapons coming at you. Neither does the United States has a similar approach. It might be low probability, higher probability than before, but low probability, but it's incredibly high risk, and you want to stay prepared for it. Now, they are also a tool of deterrence against other things, and I'll get back to this a little bit later. Nuclear weapons are a critical component of Russia's military bureaucracy. Particularly the land-based ICBM systems, which are run by the Strategic Rocket Forces, which is its own branch of the military, right? So where America's ICBMs belong to the Air Force, Russia's ICBMs belong to themselves. There's a huge industry associated with Russian nuclear weapons, with labs, manufacturers, et cetera, spread across Russia, and a lot of jobs involved. So all of these things fit into how Russia thinks about and how Russia values its nuclear weapons. Now, the vagaries of how Russia has built its strategic nuclear forces over time and how they've evolved have left it with a force that remains heavily dependent on land-based ICBM systems. Yes, it has submarines, it has submarine-launched missiles, and it's producing a new generation of these, but they don't patrol that much. Last I checked, Pavel may have better, newer information, but the fact is that what's survivable, the survivable force component of Russia's force posture is road-mobile ICBMs. And I'm not sure that they have as much confidence in their survivability, at least under certain conditions. You got to get them on the road early enough. You've got to be confident that the adversary can't track them. And the newer Sarmat, which Putin made a big deal of a few weeks ago, is another silo-based system. So to an outside observer, Russian nuclear force posture might look an awful lot like a first-use posture, which is weird. At least one amenable to first use. But if you're looking at the United States, which has a whole lot of submarines, it's a silly first use posture, right? Because you're not going to actually eliminate your adversary's forces with your first use. So something weird is going on here. And I would argue, and again, kind of my first substantive disagreement with Matt here, for all of the modernization that Russia's doing, I look at the US forces and I look at how they're structured, and yes, there are things that maybe are inefficient and ineffective. I'm going to say that the US is still probably first in line. Effectiveness, efficiency, technology, all of these things. Yes, we're starting the modernization curve, et cetera, et cetera. But gee whizzery aside, I'll put faith in US systems first. Russia also has a lot of non-strategic nuclear weapons. A lot of these are legacy systems, where we see new developments related to non-strategic nuclear weapons, non-strategic, not the whiz-bang stuff we heard about a few weeks ago. Most of that's dual-use systems, so things that can be both nuclear and conventional. And they get deployed as conventional systems. As Pavel can tell you, probably will tell you, Russian tactical nuclear weapons are, for the most part, in central storage. So there's a latent nuclear capability here. And this is when we talk about the Iskander, Kalibr, et cetera, and people will say, oh my God, nuclear weapons are being deployed in the Baltics. Well, no, a system that you could put a nuke on is being deployed to Kaliningrad. So, you know, breathe. Okay, so what's Russia's strategy for nuclear weapons, and why don't I think it's what gets termed as escalate to de-escalate? I'll start with some history, because the way that Russia thinks about nuclear deterrence has evolved over time. And I'm going to tell a slightly different story than the one Matt told. When Russia inherited the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union, it was conventionally weak, and it had a formal stated doctrine that publicly relied on nuclear weapons to respond to any sort of attack and to deter it, conventional or nuclear. They debated a lot how credible this was, but it's what they went with. People were uncomfortable with it. Some people thought it could only be a stopgap, but they didn't think they had a choice. Now, other people liked the idea, cheap way to keep Russia safe. Among the people who liked that idea were folks representing strategic rocket forces. And in 1997, the defense minister became Igor Sergeyev, a former Strategic Rocket Forces commander. And he had a pretty public fight, he and his people did, with the chief of the general staff, Anatoly Kvashnin, who came from the ground forces, and didn't really feel that nuclear weapons were the solution to all of Russia's problems. And he wanted to spend a little more on everything else. In 1999, or thereabouts, Sergeyev seemed to have won. This is when I would argue Russia did have a strategy that looked a lot like escalate to de-escalate. The idea was that, you know, this is what we'll do early. Now, this isn't necessarily about tactical weapons, the non-strategic weapons, but it is about an early strike in a conventional context. And a June 1999 military exercise actually modeled this. And a new military doctrine issued in early 2000 said that nuclear weapons could be used, allowed for the use of all available forces and assets, including nuclear, in the event of need to repulse armed aggression if all other measures of resolving the crisis situation have been exhausted and proven ineffective. And then after this, the tide shifts. Part of this might have been a response to Zapad 1999. Yeltsin is said to have walked out of it kind of horrified. But Russian officials dropped this de-escalation stuff in their remarks. And instead, they talked about nuclear weapons as intended to deter nuclear use, particularly a US first strike. And the SRF, the Strategic Rocket Forces, were demoted from a service to a branch, and Sergeyev was fired as defense minister. So this rhetoric kind of sticks around through the 2000s. And conventional reform moves in fits and starts with no real focus on it until after the Georgia War in 2008. In 2010, we've got another debate that happens. There are indications that Russia's going to drop the nuclear threshold. There was an exercise in 2009 that seemed to maybe test nuclear use. The Security Council Secretary Patrushev made some comments late in the year that the new doctrine would allow for preventive nuclear strikes and nuclear use in regional, local, and large-scale war. But the doctrine that actually came out in early 2010 did not reflect this. Instead, it said nuclear weapons are for deterring weapons of mass destruction and can be used, in response to other nuclear weapons, other WMD, or in case of an existential threat to the state. We can argue about what an existential threat to the state is, but what this says to me is there was a fight. There were people who wanted a lower nuclear threshold, and they lost. And this happened again in 2014. When there was more brinksmanship, there were more comments by officials, and then the new doctrine, which again says the same thing, existential threat. And indeed, it emphasized the need for something else, developing conventional capabilities and non-nuclear deterrence. So if you think that Russian nuclear use doctrine, is to use forces early in a conflict, to stop the conflict, to stop aggression on favorable terms, which is one of the escalate to de-escalate stories, and certainly the one cited in the Nuclear Posture Review, then you think the Russians are lying in the formal doctrine. Now, people who think the Russians are lying point to three things: exercises, capability, and rhetoric. Okay, but if you look at the exercises, they don't show this. That's not what they're exercising. There's a nice new piece by Bruno Chartres that actually goes through these, so I won't, you can read it. And that's not what you see. Okay, capability. If they have it, that must be, then I can ascribe whatever I want to it, and that must be the way they intend to use it. Okay, they have a lot of tactical systems. Most of them are legacy systems. But that doesn't tell me what their actual strategy for using them is. We have these things too in the United States. So, I'm not going to be convinced that any specific strategy ascribed, particularly one that people have denied, is the right one just because it could be that. I mean, they could also plan to launch them into midair for giggles, but I'm guessing they're not. And rhetoric. So we hear a lot about Russian saber rattling, discussion of dual use. I'm not sure the United States is in a position to talk about Russian saber rattling when we've got a president who talks about the size of his button. But fair enough, they do make vague threats towards NATO allies and prospective allies. We've got people on television, news anchors, not officials, talking about turning the US to radioactive ash. And of course, we've got Putin's new speech with all the gee-whizzery. But here's the thing, none of this is about first strike in a conflict for the benefit of Russia. It's about response. Even Putin's speech is all about response. It can, it blurs when you see the missiles heading towards Florida, which I'm not quite sure what the strategic targets in Florida are, but the actual conversation is not about first use. So what is Russia's strategy? I'll be honest, I don't know for certain. I also don't know for certain what U.S. strategy is. These things are classified, and I'm not supposed to be on a panel in New York City chatting about nuclear strategy, even if I did know. I'm pretty sure it's not escalate to de-escalate for all of these reasons, and also importantly because they do keep having these fights where people want to drop the nuclear threshold and they lose. I think it really is about deterring the United States first and foremost from large-scale nuclear attack, which Russia continues to believe is possible, and Russia continues to worry that missile defense capabilities and U.S. first strike advantages could lead to a situation where it doesn't have a secure second strike. And you can look at all these new gee-whizzery weapons in that context. You can say it's stupid, you can say U.S. missile defenses will do no such thing, you will be correct, but that's what you've got. And if you listen to Putin's speech and everything's about overcoming missile defenses, you've got to recognize that whether or not people believe it, that's the zeitgeist in Russia. I would argue that Russia also doesn't think nuclear weapons are credible or useful to deter at lower levels of conflict, the opposite of escalate to de-escalate. That's why it's putting all this effort into developing its conventional capabilities, including precision strike and new technologies, and talking about this as non-nuclear deterrence. It's been nervous about US and NATO capabilities like this for a really long time. And I think this is very much out of line with the reasoning in the Nuclear Posture Review, because the logic of tailored deterrence is that you can get just the right amount of threat at every stage in the process. It's very Herman Kahn. But I'm going more with Tom Schelling on this, that deterrence doesn't quite work like this, that it's a tough code to crack, and that you don't design neat little bespoke ladders for each adversary. You're relying to deter on the dangers of escalation, that it could go very, very badly, very, very quickly, and nobody wants that. And I think that is pretty much how the Russians think about it. That, you go low yield, the risk of high yield gets very, very real, very, very fast. And I also think that this sort of thinking is dangerous because it speaks to a desire to, sort of a balking at the idea the United States can be deterred, right? We're angry that the Russians may care more about some things than we do, and therefore they might keep us from doing something we want. It's okay for us to deter others, but it's not okay for us to be deterred, so there's got to be a way to break out of it. Well, one way to break out of it is to try to build in more steps on the deterrence ladder. The thing is, I'm not sure it's that easy to do, and particularly if you're in Europe, which is Russia's neighborhood, where Russia easily sees threats to itself from things happening near it in a way that we don't, I don't think the bespoke tailoring is going to work. The other guy can't try on the suit you've designed for him. So what would I argue instead? And I would actually, I'm going to close with this, because I actually think this is true even if the Russians do have a lower threshold for nuclear use, which I don't think they do, but if I'm open to the possibility that I can be wrong. I am sometimes wrong. I think that when you develop a strategy against a prospective adversary, you should focus on your advantages, your strengths, rather than your weaknesses. And I come back to the amount of time the Russians spend worrying about US technology, US precision capabilities, and so on and so forth. And I would note that whatever the Russians are planning, if the United States starts emphasizing nuclear capabilities, it's taking away a little bit from this advantage it has over Russia, that they're very nervous about getting into any kind of conflict with the United States because of the conventional capacity. If the United States shifts to relying on the nuclear weapons, it's giving this away. And I think, and undermining a really important advantage. So I'm going to stop here. I have more to say, but I'm going to leave the arms control and the missile defense to Pavel, and I can also come back to some of this in Q&A and in our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we will obviously have time to come back to the differences. Well, and you have two very good role models. They both hit their time perfectly. Sort of frightening.
That's a very tough act to follow, I should say. So I'm sure it is. Well, first of all, of course, thanks, Kim, for putting this event together. Thanks for bringing us here, and thank you for coming. I hope I hope you'll find this discussion interesting. And so what I will try to do, I'll try to talk about the kind of strategic, the nuclear component, and maybe try to look at what can be done and where are we as far as strategic stability and strategic balance is concerned. So I guess the good news is that we are not back, even though you hear occasionally the Cold War 2.0. I think we're not back to the kind of Cold War days when the arms race of the kind that existed then. Yes, Russia is modernizing its nuclear forces, strategic forces, and non-strategic as well. But we are not looking, if you look at the programs that are there, we're not looking at significant buildup in terms of numbers of delivery systems or warheads or any particularly new capabilities, although there is an asterisk there, and I'll talk about this Putin's zoo, as I call it, a bit later. So, and when you look at the kind of what it is that Russia is doing, Russia is not trying again to overcome the United States in any shape or form, or indeed, Russia doesn't really have any chance of doing so. So it is true that the modernization programs of the United States and Russia, they are out of sync. And when you hear people in the United States sort of pointing at Russia and saying that, oh, Russia is building up and the United States is not, and you may have seen that chart in the nuclear posture review, well, that's because in a few years they will change the roles, and it will be Russia's turn to complain because the United States will start its more than $1 trillion modernization program, and Russia will be pointing at the United States saying, oh, now the United States is building up and we have to do something. And Russia will complain. That's how it works. But from the point of view of strategic balance, if you will, as it is understood historically, we can be certain that both sides will keep the capability to reliably kill each other for many times over. So that's the reality. It's not a particularly comfortable place to be. That's for sure. But that's how we, I mean the United States and Russia, sort of designed our security. And if we don't like that place, we should think about other ways of building our security on. But at least it is a kind of familiar ground. And this is something we at least used to think about and have some instruments to deal with. So the bad news here is that when we look at the situation, there are all kind of dangers that are inherent in this strategic kind of a balance. It is kind of a balance on one from one point of view, but at the same time, there are all kind of dangers there, and little instabilities and probabilities of an accident, and those are getting things are getting more complicated, and I would argue that the chances of an accident, potential of a catastrophic type, are in fact these dangers are growing, and the prospects for getting to a safer place are not particularly bright. So we don't have a good kind of a pathway, or at least in fact the way of thinking about these dangers. So my concern here is that it could get actually significantly worse before it gets better. If you this is how it worked in the past. The kind of efforts to control nuclear arms, they came largely after the periods when things were seen as getting out of control. So the question is, are we there yet? And I don't know. It's hard to say, especially from the kind of inside. It's good to look back and say, oh, that was a really dangerous time. But normally, people have difficulty kind of realizing this at the time. And the signals are conflicting. For example, the Putin's new systems that have been mentioned here already, that were unveiled earlier this month, none of them, I should say, although they all sound like very fancy and high-tech or low-tech or unusual, at least exotic, none of them would change much in terms of balance or stability or any capability for that matter. They would certainly complicate the efforts to the arms control efforts and efforts to reach some kind of agreement, but that's the price. If there is a silver lining here to all this kind of a new range of things, these are all largely they are all in fact retaliatory weapons to a point of being kind of a grotesque, dead-handish doomsday machine kind of things, which was the point. But at least Russia is not unveiled something that would show that it tries to get a kind of a first strike or war-fighting capability of some kind. No, these are all kind of a second sort of response systems. Also, on the positive note, by unveiling all this zoo, Putin actually signaled that he's open to discussions and the arms control dialogue. And I guess in his view, he would be talking to the United States from the position of strength, so the peace through strength, which is exactly, of course, the phrase that President Trump used when he tweeted recently that he discussed so it would be good to have a dialogue with Russia. So that's good, of course, that both sides are kind of expressing their willingness to talk. The problem is that the visions of this dialogue are clearly different. So this is not a Reagan-Gorbachev kind of scenario. I think if you look at in a closest analogy, this is probably Nixon-Brezhnev of the early 70s, which brings a host of other kind of interesting associations. But again, it's possible that something can be done. So one issue that would be particularly tricky to resolve is missile defense. It is, and it's always been a thorn in the arms control discussions. And because I would guess that Russia would see that this kind of its position of strength, and it would come to the negotiating table with the idea that the United States should limit its missile defense program, and that was the whole point of this presentation that President Putin gave earlier this month. You probably know that in the United States that's a very politicized issue, and it would be very difficult to get anywhere on that point. And here I have to say a few words about missile defense because, again, the irony is that if you look at it closely, missile defense actually doesn't, in spite of all the efforts and resources that were poured into the program, the missile defense does not really offer any protection to anyone. It cannot protect the United States from North Korea or Iran should they have the capability to strike the U.S. territory, not to mention Russia. I would argue that even if missile defense works, its role would be totally marginal in any plausible scenario. And we have seen that missile defense doesn't really work. So that's, but the politics of the issue is such as it is, and missile defense poisons everything, and U.S. Russian relations in particular, and will continue to do so, unless there is a consensus that basically that the utility of missile defense is really marginal. And you can see actually there are some signs of people getting there. If you follow the discussions about the North Korean threat and the ability of missile defense to do something about that, you would see people basically saying pretty openly that no, there is nothing that that missile defense can do to protect the United States from being kind of blackmailed by North Korea, should North Korea have the capability to strike the U.S. territory. But in any event, this is a long discussion, and we will have to deal with this missile defense issue for some time, for a long time. So the question is, do we have a common ground between the United States and Russia to keep the arms race under control? Unfortunately, I think we do. The New START Treaty that was mentioned earlier by Matt and by Ola, it actually it does provide a mechanism that offers transparency and predictability, and in fact, it even deals with this kind of thorny issue of missile defense. If you read the preamble, it says there that in the language there is that in general there is a link between offense and defense, and the current system does not undermine does not threaten any capabilities on any sides, which is a perfectly reasonable way to describe it. So, and in fact, it does. The New START Treaty offers a way of talking about all these kind of new systems that President Putin introduced. There is a mechanism there for discussions, and I think that mechanism should be invoked. And best of all, the treaty can be extended for 5 years by a very simple decision. So does not require a lot of discussion. It would be just a presidential decision to do so. It will be in force if it is extended. It will be in force until 26, and that should give us some kind of a room to discuss other issues. So basically my pitch here would be that if with the U.S. Russian relations being what they are, this is the step, this is an easy step, and I would argue that this is a very important step that can be done and that should be done. So extending the New START is the priority, should be a priority. So moving beyond that would be, arguably would be more difficult. There are a lot of issues on the table, from cyber to space to, again, missile defense. But I would again argue that it would be better if we keep those issues kind of separate from the core New START and just concentrate on the New START kind of dealing with the issues it deals with, the strategic weapons. One particular problem I feel I need to talk about, and because this is again something that will make the future effort even more complicated, is the nuclear weapons in Europe and the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in particular. So it is, I guess it's safe to say that unless there is some resolution of this, the INF Treaty issue, which is, as you know, the United States accused Russia of being violating the treaty. So unless this issue is resolved, it would be difficult to see how any future Congress could vote or could approve other arms control treaty with Russia, because it's possible, but it would be extremely difficult, and I think politically that would not be possible at all. And I'm on the INF Treaty and these kind of accusations. I think I'm reasonably optimistic in the sense that I do believe that if there is a kind of, as they say, political will on both sides, there are technical ways of actually resolving these issues. These are these compliance issues. They are pretty technical, so I won't get too deeply into them. But there is a way of doing that. Again, it will have to be done in a cooperative way, and that would be very difficult because again, any resolution would imply a certain degree of trust on both sides, which is not exactly what we have today. But again, if there is a will, there is a way. And unfortunately, it's not just Russia. In my sense is that in the United States, there is, even though the United States kind of says officially that it is interested in keeping that treaty alive, I think the situation is more complicated, and there is no particular kind of a support to this idea of resolving this controversy. And another important issue to keep in mind when we talk about this dispute about this intermediate nuclear forces is that we should not pretend that if we resolve that issue, the INF compliance issue, that everything will be okay as far as Europe and nuclear weapons in Europe are concerned. I think that's not correct, because there are other nuclear weapons in Europe, and there are similar weapons, and they will be present there, and they will be will actually make the security situation in Europe more difficult. And in fact, I would argue that if we look at the way the role that nuclear weapons in Europe play, what we see is that Russia, probably deliberately so, emphasizes what I would call a nuclear ambiguity. It has a range of systems that can be used as conventional and nuclear, and Russia kind of deliberately emphasizes that there is uncertainty whether these weapons are nuclear. and that uncertainty gives Russia an advantage in any conflict because this is, I think, what Olga described very well, sort of you don't, sort of NATO and the United States just don't get involved in certain conflicts because they realize that there is a chance that at some point of that conflict, nuclear weapons can be part of the situation, and that's something that definitely the United States and NATO, in many cases, take Crimea or Eastern Ukraine, are not willing to do. And in fact, there are scenarios that would involve the NATO countries. For example, Estonia, poor Estonia, always been used in these examples. But you would not imagine that Russia will roll its tanks into Estonia. I mean, if there is any conflict or any crisis there, it would be much more kind of in a gray zone. And again, you could imagine that having this kind of a nuclear ambiguity, Russia could deter NATO from taking any active steps in that kind of uncertain situation. So the bottom line here is I think that the security in Europe would be much better off if we would have a reliable way of knowing that no nuclear weapons are involved in any conflict in the continent. And the way to do that is to take nuclear weapons out. And there are ways of doing so in a kind of a verifiable way. So this is just, let me plug in, there is a study we did at Unidir some time ago. I'll put these leaflets there. So there are ways of doing so. And today, the U.S. weapons in Europe, nuclear weapons in Europe, actually play the only role that they play is they legitimize Russian weapons, nuclear weapons. And that's, I think, gives Russia an advantage. Again, Olga mentioned it, that when the United States relies on its nuclear capability, it sort of brings Russia, gives Russia exactly the way of bringing nuclear weapons into the equation, and this is where the United States loses its advantage in conventional forces. So that's, and in that sense, the NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, actually got this whole thing exactly backwards, emphasizing the need to bring more weapons into Europe. Not to mention that there are like a lot of political issues with this strategy in the alliance relationship, but that would give, again, bringing more weapons would only give Russia a chance to use that to its own advantage. So I just don't see how the security of NATO or Europe in general, Russia included, would be served by this development. So let's, the final point is that, I don't know, I thought that at some point I sounded more optimistic than probably the events warrant, but I do believe that there are steps that can be done today, and there is a way of dealing with these imbalances, instabilities, and risks. And whether the current U.S. and Russian leadership can actually move forward, that's another matter. That's for all of you to decide. Thank you.
I'm going to take the privilege or the power of the chair to make a couple of brief comments, put a question out, but not ask you immediately to respond to it or to each other now. You'll have an opportunity to do that at the end. Other questioners can, if you'd line up at the microphone, and when you ask your question, just give your name and affiliation. And I'm not going to let you do what I'm going to do. That is because just three quick points. One is, we haven't talked about Pavel did a little, what the Europeans want. I mean, to the extent we're talking about INF and other things, I think that's a very important. I don't fault any of you. You know, we've got more than enough on our plates, but we should keep that in mind. Second point, and really, Olga brought it up, and I think many of us know this. We are, to some extent, recycling old arguments. Schelling on the one hand versus, say, Herman Kahn, now Albert Wohlstetter, with my old friend Bill Kaufman being on both sides. And this is, these arguments just deal with the dynamics of escalation, which will come up also in the cyber context later. And they're very hard questions. We don't have a lot of evidence. But I think when we talk especially about the Baltic scenario, which is the one I think we worry about, we really do come back to a lot of these questions. Okay, I just, I've not followed nuclear stuff as closely as I used to, but I do want to stress that from at least the people I believe, partly your colleague Keir Lieber and my former colleague Austin Long, and the recent reports about the improvements in the warheads, what I hear, I can't fully judge it, but I find convincing, is that land-based systems are obsolescent, if not obsolete. They are vulnerable. The progress in precision strike, even conventional precision strike, coupled with various forms of ISR, mean that you can no longer rely on any fixed system. If you're really worried, now, you can say the whole thing's paranoid, but we have to accept paranoia as the sort of assumption going in. And these are areas, that is the reconnaissance, command control, where the U.S. advantage presumably is much, much greater than of the Russian, unless this has changed recently. Certainly true in the Cold War, I believe is still true. And the American precision strike, much more capable. And, as I think it was Olga who said, the Russian posture is much more reliant on the land-based systems. So if you think at the highest end of nuclear, I think it's just clear who should worry more, the Russians, and if you assume most countries worry more than they in some sense should, which is that's the way you have to in doing, if not worst case, bad case, I would think the Russians are deeply, deeply worried about still the survivable, certainly of their land-based forces, if not of a second strike capability. And I think that's the important. Okay, the question that I want maybe you to think about and come back to, it's an impossible question, but maybe the largest, the relation between the strategic, the nuclear issues, and the broader political issues. Which is the dog, which is the tail? Okay, we know they influence each other, but I'm not going to let you get away with that easy answer. We all know that. But more nuance into what extent is the deterioration of Russian-American relations caused by some of the nuclear problems, or is it the other way around? And if we were interested to take not the topic of our panel, but the topic Kim has given us for the conference as a whole, are we the dependent variable or the independent variable? Let me open it up. Yes, Cynthia.
Cynthia Roberts, thank you for a great panel. My question, a quick comment and a question that follows Bob's, actually. The comment is, I myself have read a lot on this Russian nuclear strategy. I've written on it. And I wonder if it's also useful, related to Bob's question, whether we need to distinguish more between signaling and doctrinal issues. That's what I tried to do when I was writing about this. And when Putin is making nuclear threats, or others in the Kremlin are making these nuclear threats, we should be careful not to assume that that necessarily is what Russian military doctrine or strategic nuclear doctrine holds. And on the second, specifically on Russian nuclear doctrine, in debates I had with former administration officials who kept sending me excerpts from, well, what about this statement or that statement? I found in going back and reading all of it all over again that Olga makes, I think, the better argument. So that always leads me to wonder, as I've thrown back to my friends and colleagues in Washington, is, well, what is the key factor that I'm missing when I read Violin and Whistle or I read the doctrine itself? And sometimes it's a statement I'll get sent, you know, it's Patrushev. Okay, well, if he were writing the doctrine, then I think we should all be very worried. It would be quite different than what it is. So my question is for Matt, what is the single factor that you're reading that I'm missing? Thank you.
We'll let the panel answer, starting with Matt, and the others can comment, and I may have a comment. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, because that is one of the issues I wanted to respond to. And I think here's a situation where Olga, and I think you and I agree on all the facts, and it's a difference of interpretation of what do these facts mean, and then what are the implications for the United States government. So I think it's on interpretation and implications where we may disagree. So first, I think in Olga's presentation, she focused heavily on doctrine. But doctrine's a piece of strategy, but it's not strategy. You know, my doctrine is to work out 4 times a week. That doesn't always happen. And so, you know, doctrine is something you write down in formal statements, but it doesn't mean that's the way you would actually behave in a conflict. So China, for example, has a formal no first use doctrine. They say they would never use nuclear weapons first, only if attacked with nuclear weapons. But then you talk to, track 2 dialogues, talk to Chinese scholars who focus on this, raise some plausible scenarios about U.S.-China conflict, and they say they might use nuclear weapons first. And so if Russia were in a conflict where it had an incentive to use nuclear weapons first, do we really think they wouldn't because it says so in the formal doctrine? I don't think so. So it's one piece of evidence, but it's not all the evidence. Second, even if you look at the formal doctrine, there is a reasonable interpretation that it says that Russia could use nuclear weapons first. So the statement that Russia would use nuclear weapons first if the existence of the Russian state was under threat. So how do you interpret that? Some former Obama administration officials with responsibility for Russia have said that they believe, that Putin believes, that losing a war with NATO would risk his control of power, and in his mind that's synonymous with the existence of the Russian state. So that Putin, essentially one interpretation of that is that Putin would use nuclear weapons anytime he was afraid of losing a war on his periphery. So I think, Olga, and you are correct that the formal doctrine was changed in 2010. And so one interpretation is one side lost, the other side won. I've spent a short amount of time in bureaucracy, and I know that usually there's not a clear winner for any side, rather what you get is a compromise. And so it seems to me like another interpretation is that this is a compromise that essentially tried to placate both sides, and so there is the possibility still of first use in there. The other point that's mentioned is that Russia would rather do these conventional strikes, and the idea is to substitute conventional de-escalatory strikes for nuclear. I do think that Russia would like to go in that direction, but I'm not sure they're there yet with their conventional capabilities, so I still think they're relying on the nuclear capabilities for de-escalation. And the language they use for the conventional strikes is, one term they've used is pre-nuclear, which suggests that there's nuclear to follow.
That is not the term.
Okay.
It's really it helps to read Russian sometimes. The pre-nuclear is an American invention. I'll leave that there.
Well,
what would your translation of the term here be?
Not nuclear?
Well, so I don't read Russian. I'm
Sergei corrects me with non-nuclear rather than not nuclear, but you know.
Okay.
So, yeah. Неядерный.
Well, I don't read Russian, so I was relying on others. But that point aside, so these points, there is the formal doctrine is only a piece. There are a lot of other things to be concerned about: capabilities, exercises, statements, and if I put myself in Russia's shoes, this would be my strategy. It makes a lot of sense given their strategic circumstance. So I understand it, yet it poses a threat to the United States. And so Olga and others do a good job, I think, of providing these assurances of, here's this more benign interpretation. The problem is that's not the official Russian interpretation. As Pavel points out, the official Russian interpretation is to purposely blur and have ambiguity and explicitly point out that these capabilities are dual use, could be nuclear in nature. And so if our interpretation should be this isn't a threat, it should be Putin telling us it's not a threat, the Russian government telling us it's not a threat, not experts based in the United States. So even if Russia wouldn't use nuclear weapons first, it is clearly using the threat to use nuclear weapons first already from Ukraine and other crises, using this as a tool of intimidation. And final point, scholars and policymakers have to approach this situation differently. So if we look at historical cases when the United States has been attacked, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, experts debated, is this a real threat or not? In those two cases, we saw that it was a threat. In this situation, I think there is uncertainty. There's always uncertainty in international politics, but there's enough evidence here that it would be irresponsible for the United States government not to have a plan to respond to this. And so the Trump administration and their nuclear posture review has a plan to respond to it, and I think it's the right move. And again, if Russia doesn't want us to go in this direction, then they should be doing much more in terms of reassurances. And it shouldn't be up to Olga to explain that this isn't a threat. It should be Putin himself.
So let me, very quickly, since we have other questions and not all the time in the world. So Mattis said doctrine doesn't define behavior. Absolutely. And I'd also argue and have argued that Russians are fairly comfortable with a bit of a disconnect between what your doctrine says and how you actually fight, perhaps even more so than Americans. But the NPT and other authors have said that this is Russian doctrine. So, I guess you can have it both ways, but at least be honest about the fact that you're trying to. And then we're back to trying to control escalation and deciding who gets to do this. If you think the Russians have an incentive to use nuclear weapons first, you think that they can control escalation. And there's nothing in anything they've said or done or the way they've behaved that suggests that. All of the ambiguity is about reminding everyone that you can't control escalation. It's not about threatening to do this because the Russians think that they can, which actually takes us to the Baltic scenario. Does Putin think that losing a war with NATO would mean losing power? Oh my God, Putin thinks that a war fought in Europe against NATO means the end of the world for him and for everybody else, which is why the Russians do not want to fight a war with NATO. And which is one of many reasons the Russians don't plan to have a war in the Baltics. Now, that's not to say there isn't any scenario for how something like this could evolve because of the way that our conventional forces are postured, Russian and American and NATO, around the Baltic Sea, around Kaliningrad. Almost anything that flares up anywhere in Europe would eventually get you to the Baltics. It's not a Russian little green men invading Estonia quietly while nobody notices scenario. It's an escalation scenario from something else. The Russians are scared of this, and they would like us to be scared of this too, so we can all stay away from it as historically we've done. And I think they're very worried that the nuclear posture review, U.S. Behavior in Europe, all of that suggests that maybe the Americans aren't as scared as they ought to be.
Do you want?
Yeah, let me just a couple of things on something that Robert said. That one important point of what do Europeans want and think, and I think there is no phone number for Europe, as we know. But I guess you could sense that Europe definitely doesn't want to be in that fight, and especially with for example, if you look at the INF Treaty, the U.S. Allegations, it's still, I think that the United States is still struggling to bring Europe to actually agree and say very loudly that Russia is in violation, and and everybody, Russia included, understand that any attempt to deploy something nuclear on the European soil would basically cause serious tension in the alliance. So, and a brief point on these land-based systems, because again, Olga actually said it as well. yes, it is true that Russia bases everything on land, but you could think of it there are different ways of thinking about what do you want out of your strategic force, and one is that you want the balance in the sense that the guy who has the throw weight advantage after the third strike wins. That's the kind of a liberal press and others. They may argue that the United States has the capability to inflict the damage to the Russian forces. Or the other way of thinking is that does Russia have a non-zero chance of actually delivering something in response to a U.S. attack? And the answer to that is absolutely. And that's all it needs. And this is how deterrence works. And this is why Russia doesn't really worry about the kind of this vulnerability.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm not a specialist on nuclear, issues. So my question is very general. So I guess I think it was Matt who said that we went down, from having over tens of thousands of strategic nuclear weapons now to only about 1,000 on both sides. So my question to you really is: has there been any change in the American nuclear posture, like in the sense that I think I heard, President Trump saying that he wants to, spend a lot more money on nuclear weapons. So I guess my question is: has there been any change in the American, nuclear doctrine, in the sense that America wants, or at least President Trump wants to take us back to the days of the Cold War in terms of just spending a lot more money on nuclear weapons, and that in turn might actually lead Russia to also to build more nuclear weapons. In other words, are we going back to the days of the Cold War in terms of having a lot more nuclear weapons in general because of a possible change on the American side?
Let me just clarify two things, I think, and Matt, maybe first, what was in the Obama, a modernization package that I think going, and then on top of that is there, you talked about, the submarine, the more tactical, but is there anything in the NPR or other things about, in concrete terms, that Trump is proposing above and beyond the Obama program?
Yep. Well, thank you both for good questions. So first, the 31,000 number from 1967 was a lot of that were the tactical battlefield nuclear weapons in Europe. So it wasn't all strategic. So we have this distinction between strategic and non-strategic. Some people think it's a distinction without a difference, but there is a distinction. So the New START Treaty is 1,550 strategic deployed. In terms of spending a lot more money on nuclear weapons, our nuclear capabilities are old. They were built in the 70s and 80s, our missiles, submarines. So I don't know if you drive a car, but if you do, it probably wasn't built in the 70s and 80s, and if you did, you wouldn't get it and expect it to work all the time. So as long as the United States is going to have a nuclear deterrent, we need to modernize these forces. So Obama put in place a plan in 2010 to modernize the three legs of the triad, bombers, submarines, and missiles, over the course of the next 30 years. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that this will cost $1.3 trillion over the next 30 years, which is a big number, but you put that into context, it's about, depends on the year, but between 5 to 7% of the U.S. defense budget. So some argue that this is unaffordable, but Secretary Mattis, and actually every Secretary of Defense going back to Hagel, have said that nuclear deterrence is the most important mission of the Department of Defense. So in my view, 5 to 7% of the defense budget for the most important mission is reasonable cost, but reasonable people, I guess, can disagree. So that's the Obama plan that's continuing under Trump. In addition, the Trump administration is calling for two new, what they call supplemental capabilities beyond this. One is taking the submarine-launched ballistic missiles that we have, which right now only have high-yield warheads on them. So they're two-stage thermonuclear warheads that would have a very big yield. And so one of the changes is just to take that two-stage thermonuclear weapon and disable the second stage. so to make it a single-stage atomic weapon, which would give it a lower yield. So that's a pretty, I would say, modest change, and if anything, it's towards reduced lethality, not greater lethality. And then the second change is to bring back a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. So you've probably, when the United States struck Syria last year for chemical weapons use, that was this Tomahawk sea-launched cruise missile. During the Cold War, the United States had a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. It was retired in 2010 by President Obama. So the second change in the Trump nuclear posture review is to reinstate that capability to build a new nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. And again, both of these kind of lower yield capabilities are meant to be a response to the possible threat of Russian limited nuclear attack. So pretty modest changes, I think, overall. Now, some of Trump's rhetoric has suggested that he has something else in mind. He's talked about building a nuclear arsenal at the top of the pack and some other things. And so I understand why people who aren't following it closely think that maybe the United States is getting ready for a big nuclear buildup. But if you look in the nuclear posture review, the actual capabilities called for, it's basically continuing Obama's modernization plan, plus a couple of modest supplemental additions beyond that.
Hi, Carl Robichaud, Carnegie Corporation of New York. I was wondering if you could help me decipher some of the investments that Russia has been making, which I find frankly puzzling, right? So if Russia is concerned about missile defense, as they say they are, and as we believe they are, the types of systems that they unveiled a few weeks ago that are in development all seem designed to counter missile defense, right? However, there are lots of other ways that you could use to counter missile defense, many of which are cheaper, including decoys, penetration aids, et cetera, and current US missile defense is not able to reliably counter a North Korean nuclear threat, never mind a Russian nuclear threat. And given that Russia is not exactly flush with cash at the moment, it seems puzzling that they would invest at really great cost in all of these systems, rather than in filling some of the gaps that Professor Jervis mentioned in terms of the vulnerability of their silo-based systems, really weak command and control, poor early warning. These are things that could be remedied at lower costs. So I'm assuming there's some kind of domestic politics or bureaucratic component, but I haven't heard a really good description of that yet, and I'm interested in hearing a little bit how, why that puzzle exists. And secondly, the INF. The INF violating missile, or the allegedly violating missile. What's the rationale for that, and why would Russia pursue that at such a high political cost?
Very good.
Shall
You
I
want to
try?
start? You're
Well, if none of these things make sense, that I think we agree. And especially if you're looking for things to defeat missile defense, none of those systems really is useful. But that's not how the defense industry and the military works. So it is clear that there is in the internal process anything that is brought to the table with this label that this thing will defeat missile defense gets attention and gets funding, and then sort of this is how it worked in the Soviet Union. This is how it works largely in Russia. So there is just, that's the explanation. I would just say that Russia does invest things into early warning and command and control, so that these are not things that are neglected. And apparently these things are not necessarily very expensive, I would say. I mean, again, there is a competition for money. We've seen just recently there was a confirmation that a couple of programs were cut in favor of these kind of a new zoo, but those were not really necessary either. So the rail mobile missile and things like that. So So I wouldn't read too much into this, again, this kind of thing, other than this is how the defense industry gets what it wants. And largely, I think this is also the story with the INF missile, the violating missile. In a way, what happened was apparently one of the design bureaus, they were working on the new cruise missile, the sea-launched cruise missile Caliber that we've seen being used actually in Syria, in conventional, of course, and they looked into the option of deploying this on land. Russia insists that it is technically not in violation of the treaty, which I think they may have the kind of a plausible deniability there, or at least this is, again, in the internal discussion, this is how they explain that system. So it's not like it was a kind of a conscious, blatant violation of the treaty. No, they believe that this is everything is okay, and it's just a misunderstanding, or kind of the United States just misreads what's actually happens. So there is, as I said, there is a room there for a technical kind of resolution. It would be difficult, but there is a room there. So that's, again, back to your question. It was a kind of an incremental improvement in capability, and they believe that they are kind of in compliance with everything. And so there was no, from Russia's point of view, there is no political cost, because there is no violation there. So that's the thinking, at least.
Olga, do you want to add anything, or?
I agree with everything, almost everything Pavel said. On missile defense, the one thing I would add, which basically just affirms what Pavel's comments, is that convincing Russian defense industry that they needn't worry about American missile defense because it doesn't work is like convincing the U.S. U.S. defense industry and Congress that they should give up on missile defense because it doesn't work. Everyone is determined to keep spending taxpayer money on missile defense and/or countering it, because boy, is there a lot of money in it, despite the fact that it doesn't work. On the rationale for the ground-launched cruise missile, I think there's nothing they can do with this thing that they can't do with sea-based capabilities. So, because I'm a fan of bureaucratic explanations, I wonder if the ground forces wanted the same thing. And I also, when I start thinking about that, I also think that a ground-based system is cheaper. I also want to underline the fact that just because it's a violation of a treaty with nuclear in the name does not mean that it's a nuclear system necessarily. Because I see a lot of things saying, Russia is building a new nuclear system in violation of the INF Treaty. Well, it's building a system in violation of the INF Treaty. It may or may not be dual capable. It may or may not be nuclear. But what it's being deployed, especially, probably not actually nuclear. At least I haven't seen anything that supports that. So.
Matt, you wanted to, and then we'll have the final question and allow people to wrap up.
Just a quick comment, and thanks for the question, Carl, and thanks for your support of work in this area. And I won't provide any more insight into Russian thinking on these issues, because you've got the two leading experts next to me. I just wanted to comment on two other issues that have come up. One, come into defense of American missile defense policy a bit more, because I think that it does work for the threat that it's intended to deal with. It's not intended to pose a threat to Russia or China. It's meant to deal with threats from rogue states like Iran or North Korea. So if you look at U.S. Homeland missile defenses, we have 44 interceptors with a plan to expand up to 100. If you look at the testing data and tests, they're accurate about 50% of the time. In real-life scenario, they'd be accurate less often than that. But the United States plans not to use one interceptor for an incoming missile, but to shoot multiple interceptors. So if you multiply, 25% times, plus 25% plus 25%, if North Korea shoots a couple of missiles at us, I think we have a pretty effective defense. Now, if their capabilities continue to grow, then we'll either have to stay ahead of that threat or we will no longer have an effective defense. But I think for what it's intended to do, it does provide an effective defense. And that's also why it's not a threat to Russia, because, again, if Russia shoots 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons our way, our 44 interceptors aren't going to make much of a dent in that. Second, on the European issue and how do the Europeans think about this, I was in Brussels running a workshop on this issue in November. There's a split in Europe between the defense establishment and I think the foreign ministry, similar splits in the United States, but the defense establishment sees this as a problem and is basically supportive of the Trump administration's steps. Although one of the things they said is that if you think you need these nuclear capabilities, we understand that, but please just don't deploy them on European soil because that's going to cause a major problem. And so that's why I think you've seen the development of these two new sea-based capabilities that can be placed on U.S. ships, because the United States could have considered ground-based systems, but that would have been much more controversial in Europe.
Justin is the last question.
Justin Campbell, Columbia University. So I intended to come up here and ask about cyber issues and what your assessment is of how they affect strategic stability. But given that the question of low-yield weapons has come up twice, I'd like to ask about that instead. So my question is primarily directed toward Professor Kronig, but if anyone else feels like they could address it, I'm very interested in what you have to say. So you rightly pointed out that the NRP says in it that the U.S. Or calls for the development of more low-yield weapons, aka neutron bombs. Is that correct? Are there different weapons?
Yeah, so it would be a submarine-launched cruise missile and a low-yield warhead on the submarine-launched ballistic missile.
Right. So I'm not a nuclear expert. My understanding of low-yield weapons is that they're designed primarily not to destroy materials or infrastructure through concussive or explosive bursts, but to spew radiation over certain territory. That's the primary effect of that. Is that incorrect? No? Okay.
Yeah. So in the late, I guess it was, and Bob might be more suited to speak to this than me, but there was a debate about a neutron bomb in the 1970s.
Under Carter, yeah.
Yeah, in the United States that would have been a weapon designed to kill people with prompt radiation, but not to have a large destructive effect. That's not what these capabilities are designed to do. So they're lower yield, so they're still nuclear, they're still higher yield than our most advanced conventional weapons. But it's something that you might be able to use in a battlefield situation without causing a lot of collateral damage. And that is something that's important for U.S. nuclear strategy that I think a lot of people overlook. And you can read more about it in my new book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. But the United States plans for counterforce targeting. So I think some people have this idea that nuclear strategy is about threatening to slaughter a bunch of the other guys' civilians, and he threatens to slaughter a bunch of your civilians, and you have this situation of mutual terror. But for decades, the United States has planned for counterforce targeting, so using our nuclear weapons to go after the enemy's nuclear weapons or legitimate military targets, in part for moral reasons, and Obama was very clear about this in his 2013 nuclear employment guidance to the Department of Defense. And so, if you want to destroy military targets without killing a lot of people, then lower yield weapons are actually better tailored for that purpose.
So excuse me. So now that we've clarified that, I was wondering whether Russia has reciprocated. Are they also developing their own low yield weapons?
Yeah. Well, so Russia never got rid of theirs. We had big stockpiles during the Cold War. The United States got rid of a lot of its non-strategic lower yield nuclear weapons. The Russians have kept a lot of theirs. So many nuclear weapons with lower yields, including depth charges, torpedoes, and other things. So there has been this narrative in the United States that the United States risks starting an arms race with these nuclear modernization plans. But I think people who are following this closely realize that that's not the case, that the Russians have been leading in terms of developing and keeping nuclear capabilities. And Ash Carter, professor at Harvard and Obama's Secretary of Defense, has said many times that the evidence doesn't support the idea that the United States is provoking an arms race. If anything, it's the Russians who are leading in this area.
Let me now, just in closing, give the panelists the opportunity for their final comments.
Thank you. Just a couple of points on low-yield weapons. It could be a longer discussion, but let me just say that Russia may have those, but Russia has repeatedly stated that all its non-strategic weapons, we include, whether they are low yield or high yield or whatever, that they are moved to central storage. And the my usual kind of I usually call people, well, let's take Russia's yes for an answer. Let's have this agreement codified, and it could be made verifiable, and that would help solve some of the, or if not most of the issues of stability in the European context. And on this U.S. low yield option, I just think it's totally immaterial. I mean, I just don't see how, if you kind of go through the scenarios, I understand why the United States is trying to build that, because basically the United States feels that if it comes to something they use, that it would be willing to use low yield weapon and would not be willing to use high yield weapon. So there is a logic to that, but as I said, I mean, from the point of view whether Russia would be more concerned about this kind of capability, I think it's totally immaterial. It would be better just to move it away. And the final point also, and something that Matt said, that the missile defense works, I would highly doubt that against North Korea. My usual way of framing it, that missile defense works perfectly against missiles that don't exist. So as soon as you will see, and I just take my word for it, when you will see that North Korea having an actual ICBM capability, you will see the discussion, and you will see people saying point blank, this missile defense has nothing to do and cannot do anything with that particular threat. So that's how it works, and it will work that way.
And Pavel's an actual physicist.
Well, lapsed physicist.
Okay, so I'll quickly touch on the low yield bit and just say everyone had and has low yield weapons. Low yield nuclear weapons are still pretty high yield. Yes, you can target them against enemy military assets. You will still kill a lot of people. You will kill those people in Europe, which is closer to Russia than it is to the United States. Again, kind of this, and when you're developing a new one and you're planning to put it on a submarine, you do develop this problem of, can somebody tell whether it's a low yield weapon or a high yield weapon that's coming at them, what it's a precursor to, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's this, it actually goes back to signaling, and this question of, does, just because you know what you're saying and doing, does your adversary understand it the same way? And I think Bob Jervis wrote a book about that, to which the answer is not always. So let's not be that confident. I do agree with Matt that different Europeans think different things, and I think Pavel also said that, and I think that's an important, but they also really don't want more nukes in Europe. I want to close by answering Professor Jervis's earlier question about the dog and the tail. Because I think having had this conversation for, for much of this morning, I would say that the deterioration of U.S. Russian relations is not caused by our nuclear problems. It is vice versa. We would worry a lot less about all of this if the relationship was in better shape. And indeed, through the Obama administration, when we were still planning to modernize our arsenal and talking about all of this, and the Russians were modernizing their arsenal, even though the relationship was on the decline, we weren't that worried about it. Some people were, but for the most part, it wasn't rising to the level of the big debates. We are nervous now because Americans think that there might be a war in the Baltics, and the Russians look at the Americans thinking about a war in the Baltics and think, oh my God, maybe there'll be a war in the Baltics. And this is how we start thinking about all of this again.
So just quickly, I'll also pick up on Professor Jervis's question about what's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable, and I agree that the nuclear weapons are a response to the deterioration in relations, not vice versa. And I think the evidence of this is, if you look at the biggest nuclear reductions in history, they came at the end of the Cold War, when many people looked around and said, we don't really need these things anymore. And kind of final point on that, I feel like a lot of the discussion in Q&A focused on the Trump administration and what they're doing, and is this going to start an arms race, and is it destabilizing? And I don't know, I think Americans are maybe a little bit naive. I think that since after the end of the Cold War, there's been bipartisan consensus that getting rid of these things would be a nice idea. Obama, I think, was sincere in his effort to work toward global zero. He kind of had this theory that if we reduced, other countries would follow our lead. And the world didn't turn out that way. Russia and others relied more on nuclear weapons in their strategy. So I feel like there's been a lot of focus on Washington, but I think that if Moscow wants to reduce nuclear tensions, wants to reduce its arsenal, wants to rely less on nuclear weapons in its strategy, I suspect that they would find a warm reception for that idea in Washington and other Western capitals.
Kim, do you have any administrative?
Thank you.